Welcome to the City Forum podcast, recorded as part of the City Forum Intelligent Defence series. Following on from the release of City Forum's annual report, Maximising Smart Power and Public Value, General Sir Jack Deverell, Associate of City Forum, formerly a commander of a NATO Joint Force Headquarters, and Professor Paul Cornish, Chief Strategist at City Forum and Visiting Professor at LSE Ideas, the Foreign Affairs think tank at the London School of Economics, discuss national strategy, predicting the unpredictable. If you'd like to order a copy of the report and find out more, please visit www.cityforum.co.uk.
This conversation on national strategy and understanding the role and value of armed force coincides with the publication of Maximising Smart Power and Public Value, the latest report by City Forum in its Intelligent Defence series. The report covers many themes in the current international security and defence debate, and in that respect ought to be of interest to everybody really who's involved in those issues in the media and politics and academia and so on. But it should be of a special interest to those who are to be involved in the impending UK National Security and Defence Review.
It is often thought that the first duty of the state is to protect its citizens, and it has been seen as best achieved by defending the interests of those citizens. One of the lessons of history is that conflict is best kept at arm's length. You don't want to fight your adversary on your own territory because your own territory gets damaged almost certainly. And this, particularly for an island race, has led this country consistently to intervene outside their national boundaries. And this has led us to a rather more global attitude, or one of the reasons that this country's had a more global attitude than some of its European neighbours. But there is a basic requirement to defend the state and the citizens of the state from both external and internal threats. Over the past generation, there has been a massive expansion of the nature of those threats. You've had the terrorism, which has been often the source of which has often been non-state actors, sometimes at the behest of state adversaries of this country, or the Western Alliance, or the West in general. You have the impending possibility of space itself becoming a future battleground, and you have the ever-present and current threat of cyber attack. And that cyber attack, of course, interestingly enough, is often focused not on military or state infrastructure, but on that which supports it, the financial system, interference in elections, interference in government decision-making, manipulation of special focus and special interest groups to the benefit of adversaries, or merely to the detriment of our governmental systems. Defending, of course, normally implies some form of offensive action, because part of the formula to maintain the security of your citizens and your interests and your country, the geographical element of your country, is deterrence, which protection itself may not achieve. Some form of sanction is always there, inherent in our capability to wage offensive action. So the importance of deterrent remains crucial. We see this, of course, with things like our nuclear deterrent. But what about cyber? Are we capable, and is it in our interest, to take the battle to the adversary? And if not, where is the deterrence value? Are we merely protecting or are we defending? One of the advantages of a broad-based defensive capability, which spans from, let us say, cyber to conventional operations, is it gives politicians choice. Because the armed forces have the ability, in a way which almost no other arm of the state does, to engage in both soft and hard power. The soft is self-evident. It might be merely presence. It might be a cocktail party. It might be support of commercial ventures. It might be reassurance. It is often practical help delivered during times of national emergency, earthquake, plague, Ebola, whatever. But the difference is that soft power can relatively quickly and extremely effectively be turned into hard power to cope with essentially dynamic and high-risk situations. Paul, what's your view on that assessment?
Thank you, Jack. The discussion of soft and hard power, I think, is particularly interesting and important, and the latest variations of it, smart power and sharp power and all these sorts of things. The soft and hard power idea was the brainchild of Professor Joseph Nye at Harvard. And he made, as well as the analysis that you've just been giving, he made one other point, which I think is important to bear in mind. He said that soft power is about having these different tools available and using them as appropriate to the circumstances, but it's also about using the resources that are available. And I think this is a key point. And I put it in this rather crude way. A lot of people tend to think that if you're clever enough to think about soft and hard power, that somehow allows you to reduce your spending on the expensive hard power stuff, because you've also got access to relatively inexpensive soft power stuff such as communications and BBC World Service and so on and so forth. Joseph Nye makes pretty much the opposite point. He says this is not a means to reduce spending. It still requires resources. And that takes me back to the first point you made, Jack, if I may. The argument that the first duty of the state is to protect the citizen is such a powerful one, and it's writ large. And we hear it so many times, don't we, from politicians and so on, quite rightly, when they begin debating defence matters. It's a really valid starting point. It was articulated more or less in those words by Adam Smith, perhaps surprisingly. There was this great liberal free market economist making this key point. He also, though, went on to say that while this is the first duty, there's in a sense a first duty before that one, which is that defence costs money, but at no point must it be allowed to distort the economy, or you can't have massive overspending on defence if it actually destroys your economy. That would make no sense. So I've always argued that there is a kind of a prior obligation before you can get to the first duty, which is you mustn't spend too much money on it. Clearly you must spend some on it, but not too much. And I think it's what I'm coming to there really is the eternal balancing act between strategy, interest, obligations, and resources, and it goes all the way through it, and it certainly does still apply in the soft and hard power debate. If I could just pick up one other point in your opening remarks, Jack, which is concerned with cyber security and cyber deterrence. It happens to be something I'm doing some work on at the moment. There's a lot of thinking going into this at present. How do we deter in cyberspace? And quite a lot of that discussion almost naturally defaults to Cold War style deterrence. There have been some people who have said, look, we got it sorted out in the 40s and 50s, we thought hard, and we produced mutual strategic nuclear deterrence. So surely we can take those models and transplant them to the cyber era, or at the very least, if we did it then we'll do something nowadays that's similar. This worries me because having looked at it, I'm not sure that there's very much in the Cold War experience that is translatable to the cyber era, because it's very difficult to establish who your adversary is, what they want, and what they're prepared to risk. Indeed, it's difficult to establish whether they've even attacked you when they have. So there's all sorts of complications we have to bear in mind, and that's why I come to the point of resilience in a way, which I think is part of your point about protecting versus external and internal threats and indeed hazards. It seems to me that the most that we can expect in cyber deterrence is to protect our systems as best we can. If we can do that, if we can protect what we best know, the way that we use IT and so on, then we're probably giving ourselves the advantage and the initiative that the adversary, whoever they are, whatever they want, whenever they're attacking you, cannot possibly know as well as you are. So it comes, for me, to a point to do with resilience of our own systems.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, interesting this difference between the attitude to deterrence based on the Cold War and pre-Cold War attitudes as well. I mean, the bomber free 1939, one of the Royal Air Force justifications of the bomber fleet was that it would deter our adversary, essentially Germany, from bombing us if we could bomb them. So deterrence itself, I think, is seen by some people as a Cold War issue, but of course it has existed since a man first armed himself with a heavier sword than his adversary. I'd like now just to talk about understanding the role of the armed forces, because it strikes me that there is a growing mismatch between the understanding that the armed forces have of their role and the understanding that the community at large has of their role. We are in a sort of paradoxical situation, I think, at the moment, where the armed forces are one of the most respected institutions in the country, or certainly have been over the past few years. And yet there seems to be a growing separation between the understanding of what the armed forces stand for and what they do, and the society which reveres them. It's a strange phenomena, and whether this is because there is a growing sense in society of individual rights, the whole business of running your life as you would run it, the diminution of concepts of service and duty, all these things appear to be running in one direction within the community at large, and perhaps I'm making a rather gross simplification there, whereas in the armed forces there is still very strongly held the sense of service and duty and selfless commitment and all those values which are admired by people, but they don't seem to want to join them somehow. And there is a problem, will continue to be a problem over recruiting and retention because of this, what appears to be growing gulf. And I wonder what your views on that might be.
I agree with everything you've just said, Jack. And I think you made one extremely important point, which is that the armed forces know their role very well. And I couldn't agree more. They do. They spend a lot of time thinking about what they might do and preparing for it. They really do know what they're there for. And maybe that's part of the reason why we keep giving them more roles to take on, because they're so good at adapting. But one interesting contribution to one of our discussions was to suggest that there's a complete lack of understanding, as you were hinting, among the public, and especially in the, let's call it the post-Cold War generation, as to what the armed forces are actually there for. Now, if that's even half true, then it would seem that the defensive view that's about to happen might be proceeding on a massive and very unreliable assumption that people understand what this is all about. if the public really are so unaware and so ill-informed, if you like, and so uninterested in the role of armed force, if they've got no knowledge of the risks associated with the deployment of armed force on this or that type of operations, then it seems to me that politicians and strategists will surely find it ever harder to give any sort of leadership in this matter. Who are they talking to? And what would be the basis, the respectable basis of any decisions that they make? And this leads me to another question, which is included in the report, which is to ask how confident we can be that the UK has, in quotes, the will to fight. A rather straightforward, if not rather brutal question, but it's a really important one to ask. Does the UK have the will to fight? Now, I ought to say that in the course of our discussion, several other people took a very different view, arguing that there is actually a good underpinning level of understanding about what the armed forces do and what they're for, but it is not encouraged and cultivated sufficiently by our strategic leadership, not communicated well enough, and so on. If I can go on just for a second, just to say that it does seem to me that the way the armed forces contribute to national resilience, picking up the theme that we were discussing a few minutes ago, seems to me to be an increasingly important function as part of this if you call it you might call it an outreach task. I think resilience is critical to the public understanding of what was described in one of our meetings as the psychological construct of national security. If as a society we don't feel resilient and robust, then we probably don't feel secure. And that's quite an important test, I think. So the conclusion that I came to on the role of armed forces as far as resilience is concerned, or rather that the report came to, is that if we deploy the armed forces on civic resilience tasks such as flood relief, transport assistance, and so on, then it's important, I think, that these should be portrayed as civil assistance operations rather than a military operation but without weapons. I think this is a really important thing to do. But by the same token, what must be done at the same time, very usefully, very positively, is to show that the military skills, and right down to very low levels, very low. You'll know far better than I do, Jack, just how good 21-year-old young soldiers are at assessment, at planning, and at communication, and indeed as being part of a command and control system. All of these skills, I think, can all be very valuable and can be shown to be valuable outside a standard military context.
I think what is fascinating there is the points you've just touched on, and I recall the extraordinary response of the public to the soldiers who were at very short notice put on security duty at the Olympics, something which was created, as we will remember, because the commercial firm had failed to deliver that which they had said they would deliver, and soldiers were called up at very short notice. And the relationship between the soldiers and the crowd, and remember that crowd was an international crowd, was quite extraordinary. And it did the army an enormous amount of good, because the army came out, I say the army, the armed forces, because it was a joint service issue. The armed forces came out as a beacon of excellence. They were not only highly efficient, they were highly human, in a way which, in many ways, security guards are not. They almost have it trained out of them. That's a generalization. John Keegan famously said once that which kept the British Army honest was its intense local links. This was many years ago, he said it. Their intense local links. Because the locality felt the shame when things went wrong and were proud when things went right. And the soldiers went back to their locality and felt that pride or that shame. And one of his justifications of the regimental system was that sort of balancing which was created by intense local connections. And of course, that is one of the things that the breakdown of the regimental system and the reduction, the dramatic reduction in size of the army has undermined. The army in particular has not helped itself by going into the super garrisons for very sensible administrative and financial reasons. But we are now located in very, very few areas of the country who probably suffer too much army, and yet there are substantial areas of the country, very substantial areas, that have no army at all. And I think that helps or doesn't help because it tends to confirm in people's view that the army is something that strange people do. It's not a normal profession for a normal person, which I think is very damaging because we become, if we're not careful, the armed forces become somehow a society without society.
So we're making it harder and harder for the public to both to understand what the armed forces do and therefore to value what they do. And that leads me to one more thought, if I may, Jack, which is this idea of how we assess the value of the armed forces. It was a theme that went right the way through our discussions last year. And it seems to me that we can discuss value in two main ways. We can think about the return on investment, or we can take a value engineering approach and say it's all about the ratio of function to cost and so on. But we also think of value in terms of esteem, as you've been saying. It does seem to me that, if you like, the accountancy approach, the actuarial approach on the one hand, and the emotional approach on the other hand, are very closely linked. And in that regard, our report actually concludes in I think a fairly positive way. I wouldn't say it's quite optimistic, insofar as it argues that the government does have the means to improve the quality of the public discussion of and understanding of defence. One of our contributors said that defence and security have become a niche area in public policy, niche for the public, niche for Parliament, and so on. But there is a strong public appetite for high-quality information and debate on all these matters of defence and security. There is a thirst for more information, and especially on the judgments that have underpinned whatever the strategic preparations and decisions are. Give us more information. We're not completely resistant to it. And the final point to make, again, a contribution during one of our meetings, was that Parliament can and should be at the heart of this improved, more open and much more robust debate.
Well, I would endorse all that. And I think there is a more general issue here that politicians, and perhaps we saw this in the last election, politicians of all parties have lost faith and lost trust in talking to the community at large. They spent a lot of time talking to those who support them, their activists, their party members, but spend too little time taking into account the general mass of the population. And they do that both on both senses, both sides, both actually gaining from the population the views of the population, and also educating the population in some of the more difficult issues, of which defence, I think, is perhaps one of the more critical. So there is a big delta here between the values as we understand of the armed forces and the understanding in society, and therefore the justification of the existence of those armed forces, apart from a rather sentimental view that there are people doing something that I wouldn't like to do. Well, that brings us, I think, to...
This has been a Cowento.co production for City Forum.